Have you ever visited a web page only to land on a very generic 404 page? Imagine like going to the supermarket, but the entrance is closed. No signs, nothing to guide you. It's very frustrating, right? But this is exactly how our users feel when they hit one of our dead links. But what if there was a way to guide them back where they wanted to be? Today, we'll learn how to handle those cases, those missing pages, using Laravel's Route fallback method. Let's dive right in. Okay, so what we have here is a default Laravel application. I only chose SQLite for this example. So let's go ahead and try to check how Laravel handles the 404 pages so far. So this is the main page. Then we're going to visit an endpoint that doesn't exist to trigger the 404 page, right? So as we can see, we get a very generic 404 page with a message and the title not found. If we go back to PHP Storm and we try to find the 404 page, we can see that it's inside Illuminate Foundation exception views. So we have the title, the message not found, and then the code, which is 404. Very minimal in this case. But this also indicates that we don't give the user any kind of help, right? We don't guide them back to where they wanted to be. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Laravel's Route fallback. But before we do that, we're going to create a controller, because we're going to use this controller as an invocable controller and pass it as a parameter to Route fallback. So let's go and create the controller, PHP artisan make controller, and then we're going to name that web fallback controller. Let's go back, web fallback controller. And as we mentioned, this is going to be an invocable controller. So invoke. We're going to use request. And that's it for now. Let's go back to our web.php file and our routes and call route fallback and pass the name of the controller. So web fallback controller class. And now the fallback route will call our invocable web fallback controller in this case. So here, what would we like to do? The thing we would like to do is first, we would like to store the invalid request in our database, so we know in our analytics what happened with the user. And then we're gonna return 404 page, but enhanced. Okay, so for storing an invalid request, in this case, we're gonna use a function inside the service, and we're gonna do it synchronously. But for your own applications, if you have high volume applications, I suggest you do it asynchronously using some kind of jobs and queues. But for the sake of the example and only for that, we're gonna do it very easily, like creating a service. So let's go back in our app HTTP directory, and we're gonna create a directory called services, right? So services and a class, what we would like to name it. So I think we would like to name it analytics, because it does have to do with analytics service. So analytics service. And here we're gonna add a function which is gonna be easy to understand, right? So we're gonna call this log invalid request. We're gonna pass the request, illuminate HTTP request. And here what we want to do is use a model. We might call the model failed access. We're gonna create and add some properties. So what we want to store. First thing we'd like to store is the IP. Then we'd like to store the URL that the issue originates from. Then next thing we'd like to store would be the user agent. So user agent, we get this from the request as well. And last but not least, we're gonna use the referrer, which could be part of the header or not. So this is gonna be nullable, of course. So as you already spotted, we haven't already created the failed access model. So let's do that right now. So PHP artisan make model, and we call this failed access. We will also create migrations, seeders, and everything else needed for this model. Let's go back now and import that, right? So now going into the model, the first thing we're gonna do, so we don't hit any mass assignment exceptions, is we're gonna make this guarded and then empty, just to make sure, for the sake of the example, that there are no issues there. And then let's go into our migration and add the parameters we want. So first one would be the IP. Next one, as you already noticed, is going to be the URL. Then the user agent, which could be nullable, of course. And last but not least, the referrer, which could also be nullable as well. Let's go ahead and run the migration. PHP artisan migrate. Perfect. Now we could navigate back to the controller. So let's add the service here. So the name of the service is analytics service. So analytics service. Let's use that service and call log invalid request, and then let's pass the request as a parameter. So this is gone. Now we would like to create a new 404 page that we will also include many more information about the user, right? So let's navigate to our views directory. And we were able to overcome that by creating a new directory called errors. And inside errors, let's create a page called 404.blade.php. And this will override the actual 404 page that Laravel Route provides us by default. So what we'd like to do here, I'm going to copy HTML so you don't have to do that yourself. So before filling in the 404 page, what we would like to do is create a layout, which we're going to use in our 404 page as well. So we're going to create a new component, which we're going to call layout. It's going to be very, very basic in this case. So layout.blade.php file. And we're going to pass this part of HTML. So this is pretty basic. We have a title that falls back to the fallback demo, which is the name of the project. We import CSS using Vite, and then we yield the content. Now we go to our 404 page. So what this HTML does is we just extend the component layout you just saw before. And then in the section of content, we pass some content so we can help the user navigate easier. So what we have here is invalid request path. We're going to use the path of the request just as an identifier at the top. And we're going to provide them with 3 URLs. First one will be to get them back to the home page. The second one is for them to be able to contact us directly. And the third one is the sitemaps. We're going to use some dummy URLs in this case, just to showcase this example. But you get the idea. You can add many more URLs here as well and make it much easier for the user to navigate back. Okay. Now let's go and run npm run dev. So we have this running. We go and visit the page. We refresh. And we get an empty page. And this makes sense, right? Because we haven't yet returned this page to our user. So let's go back to our controller. And let's call abort 404. Let's go refresh. And now you see the new page here, right? So we get a new 404 page, some information that you would like to have here for your user, and then the three endpoints we have. One for going back to the home page, the contact us, and the sitemaps as well. But that's not all, right? We also have stored in our database, if we go here, failed accesses, you can see here we have the IP of the user, the URL, user agent, referrer, and when this was created. So we now have an idea of when this error was created for the user, and we are able to help them go back to where they want to be, instead of just showing them a very generic 404 page. So now let's do the same thing for the API request though, right? So let's go to our app.php file in Bootstrap and mention here that we would like the API to be read from routes api.php, and let's go and create that file. So api.php here, and we're going to do the exact same thing. So let's create the controller first. We're going to call this API web fallback controller. It's going to be an invocable controller as well. So route fallback, and we're going to call the API fallback controller class. Let's go to our controller after we fix this here. So we call invoke pass the request, and here we're going to do the exact same thing. So first things first, let's add analytics service, and let's call the log invalid request, pass the request as a parameter. Same thing exactly like the previous controller we have. And last thing, we're going to return a response. It's going to be a JSON, and then here we're going to include a message, invalid request. And we're also going to have homepage demo.dev, and last but not least, we're going to pass 404 as a status. Perfect. So now if we open up an API client like the one I have here, you see here I try to go to the API testing point. Before that, before adding the new route fallback, what we get was a generic not found HTTP exception. But now what we get is exactly like what we want. So we get the message here, invalid request, and then the home page, right? HTTP fallback demo.dev. And we can add obviously many other stuff there as well. And don't forget that we also have the new endpoint logged here in our database. Fallback demo test API/test. This comes from Insomnia, which is the client I use. Send HTTP request. So once we're done with all that, next thing we're gonna do in this case is we're gonna add some tests, right? So make sure that this is testable and working. So PHP artisan make test. We're gonna call this fallback test. So fallback test. Okay, so this is the very first test that we get from pest. We're gonna remove that and we're gonna add our own test. We're gonna call this web fallback shows custom 404 page. And what we want to do here is get the response. We're gonna go get, and then an endpoint that doesn't exist. Let's say full is fine. And then let's assert that the status is 404, and that we also see in the page something that we know that already exists. And in this case, we're gonna use contact us, right? So let's run this. It works. If we try to check for something that doesn't exist, we get an error. So it seems to be working just fine. Let's go to our next test. So the next test is going to test the database. So web for, not web, we're going to do this for both fallbacks, web and API. So fallback stores invalid request in database. So let's send in a request again to the full endpoint. And then let's try to assert database has, then we pass the table, which is called, as far as I remember, failed accesses. And here we'll check that the URL actually contains HTTP, and then it's fallback demo.test full. We run that, and this also passes as well. Okay, and last but not least, let's also check our API endpoint. So API fallback shows custom error page. So we're gonna send a JSON request in this case in /full. We're not gonna assert that there's a 404, and we're also gonna assert JSON here. I'm gonna pass that. If we go back, what we had here is a message invalid request. So message invalid request. Let's run that. We see that we get the old response here. So how we're gonna fix this? It's /API/full. Nice. Now it seems to be working fine. So we have two things here. One of them is message, and the second part, of course, is the homepage. So homepage, edit that dev here. We run that, and we are green. So now, instead of having your users stranded, we have a smart fallback for both our web and API requests. Keep in mind that in this example, I use synchronous requests in order to store our analytics in our database. But if you have a high volume application, I suggest you use some kind of queue and job system instead. Let me know what you think in the comments below. See you in the next one.